The girl collapsed against the wooden post outside the mountain trading station, her trembling hand extended toward a bearded trapper who was tossing apple cores into the dirt, and her voice came out as barely more than a whisper when she said those words that would change both their lives forever. "Give me your leftovers, please. I am starving." Garrett Sullivan stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full elk carcass down a mountain trail without breaking stride. And when he turned to look at the source of that desperate plea, his steel-gray eyes widened at the sight before him. The young woman could not have been more than 20 years old, her dress torn and filthy, her dark blonde hair matted against her pale face, and her green eyes held a hollow desperation that struck something deep in his chest. He had seen starvation before, during his 15 years living in these Colorado mountains since 1868, but something about this particular woman made him freeze in place, the half-eaten biscuit in his hand suddenly feeling like a stone. "Madam," he said, his deep voice rougher than he intended, from months of speaking only to himself and the occasional trading partner. He took a step toward her, and she flinched backward, her thin frame swaying dangerously. Garrett moved slowly then, the way he would approach a wounded animal, and he knelt down beside her, noting how her collarbones protruded sharply above the neckline of her dress and how her wrists looked like they might snap if he gripped them too firmly. "Madam, when did you last eat?" "3 days," she whispered, and then her eyes rolled back and she began to crumple. Garrett caught her before she hit the ground, his muscular arms wrapping around her slight body with surprising gentleness for a man who spent his days trapping and hunting in the wildest parts of the Colorado Territory. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel every rib through the thin fabric of her dress. He stood up with her cradled against his chest, and the few people milling around the trading post stared, but no one moved to help. That was the way of things out here in 1883. Everyone had their own troubles, their own struggles to survive in this harsh land where winter could kill you as easily as a mountain lion or a rattlesnake. "Where are you taking her?" the trading post owner called out, a grizzled man named Hank who had been watching the scene with mild interest. "My cabin," Garrett called back without slowing his stride. "And I need supplies. Put together a box of food, everything you have got that will keep. Flour, beans, dried meat, whatever vegetables you have got, sugar, coffee, everything. I will be back for it tomorrow." "That will cost you plenty," Hank warned. "Then it costs me plenty," Garrett said sharply. "Just have it ready." He carried the unconscious woman to where his large bay horse stood hitched, and he managed to mount up while still holding her, settling her across his lap like a child. The horse, a patient gelding named Buck who had been his companion for 7 years, simply snorted and began the familiar journey back up into the mountains without any urging. Garrett kept one arm wrapped securely around the woman while his other hand held the reins, and he found himself studying her face as they climbed higher into the pine-covered slopes. She had probably been beautiful once, before whatever circumstances had brought her to the point of begging for scraps. Even now, beneath the grime and the sunken cheeks, he could see fine features and thick lashes that rested against her pale skin. A bruise marked her left cheekbone, fading to yellow at the edges, and he felt anger stir in his gut. Someone had hit her, and not recently enough for his liking. The ride to his cabin took nearly 2 hours, following a trail that wound steadily upward through stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, crossing 2 streams swollen with late summer runoff, and finally emerging into a small valley that Garrett had claimed as his own 5 years ago. His cabin sat at the far end of the valley, backed against a cliff face that protected it from the worst of the winter winds, with a clear view of the approach from 3 sides. It was a solid structure that he had built himself, using logs he had cut and notched with his own hands, and it had a stone fireplace that drew well and kept the interior warm, even when snow piled 6 feet high outside. He dismounted carefully, still holding the woman, and kicked open his cabin door with one booted foot. The interior was dim and cool, a single room perhaps 20 feet square, with his bed built into one corner, a table and 2 chairs in the center, and the fireplace taking up most of one wall. Shelves lined the walls, holding his supplies and equipment, and various pelts hung from the rafters to cure. It was a bachelor's space, rough and functional, but it was clean and well organized in the way of a man who had learned that survival in the mountains required discipline. Garrett laid the woman on his bed, the only bed, and then stood back, suddenly uncertain. He had been alone for so long that he had nearly forgotten how to interact with another human being, much less a woman who needed help as desperately as this one clearly did. He turned to his small stove, built a fire quickly with practiced efficiency, and put on a pot of water to heat. Then he gathered what medical supplies he had, mostly items for treating his own injuries or sick animals, and returned to the bedside. She had not stirred, and for a moment fear gripped him that she might have already slipped too far gone to save. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck and felt the flutter of her pulse, weak but steady, and he released a breath he had not realized he was holding. He needed to get fluids into her, and food, but carefully. He had seen what happened to starving animals that were fed too quickly, and he suspected humans were not so different. Garrett mixed a thin broth using some dried venison and the heated water, adding a pinch of salt and letting it steep until the liquid took on a pale brown color. He strained it through a cloth, then lifted the woman's head gently and tried to get her to drink. At first the liquid just ran down her chin, but then her throat convulsed and she swallowed reflexively. He gave her small sips, patient and methodical, until she had taken perhaps half a cup. Then he laid her head back down and covered her with one of his thick wool blankets. Night was falling outside, the mountain darkness coming on fast the way it always did, and Garrett lit 2 oil lamps before starting to prepare a proper meal for himself. He kept glancing over at the bed where the woman lay, watching for any signs of change, but she remained deeply unconscious. He ate his dinner of fried trout and beans standing up, too restless to sit, and then he cleaned his dishes and began to prepare for the next day. He would need to ride back down to the trading post at first light to collect those supplies he had ordered, and he would need more than what Hank could provide if he was going to nurse this woman back to health. The thought made him pause, his hands stilling on the leather strap he was mending. Why had he taken on this responsibility? He could have given her his leftovers as she asked, or even bought her a meal at the trading post, and then continued on his way. Instead, he had brought her to his home, to this isolated cabin where no one would disturb them or even know she was here. The answer, he realized as he looked at her sleeping form, was that he had seen something in her eyes in that brief moment before she fainted. Beneath the desperation and the starvation, there had been a strength, a determination to survive that matched his own. He recognized it because he carried that same quality inside himself, had carried it since he was 18 years old, and had fled his father's farm in Missouri after one beating too many, heading west with nothing but the clothes on his back and a knife in his boot. Garrett made himself a bed on the floor using extra blankets and his bear hide, and he lay there in the darkness listening to the woman's breathing. Sleep came slowly, as it always did, and his dreams were troubled by memories of his own hungry years, those first brutal winters in the mountains when he had nearly died more times than he cared to count. He woke before dawn to the sound of whimpering, and he was on his feet instantly, moving to the bedside. The woman was thrashing weakly, caught in some nightmare, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. Garrett lit a lamp and saw that her face was flushed, and when he touched her forehead she was burning with fever. "Damn," he muttered, and he went to work with the efficiency of long practice. He stripped off the blanket and began to sponge her face and arms with cool water from his bucket, and he managed to get more of the broth into her, though she never fully woke. The fever raged through what remained of the night, and Garrett did not leave her side, continuously applying cool cloths and forcing small amounts of liquid between her cracked lips. Dawn came gray and overcast, threatening rain, and the fever finally broke just as the first light filtered through his windows. The woman fell into a deeper, more natural sleep, and Garrett allowed himself to collapse into his chair, exhausted, but relieved. He would still need to make that trip down to the trading post, but perhaps it could wait a few hours while he caught his breath. He must have dozed off despite his intentions, because the next thing he knew, the sun was higher in the sky, and someone was watching him. His eyes snapped open to find the woman awake, propped up slightly on one elbow, staring at him with those startling green eyes. They were clearer now, more focused, and he could see intelligence in them along with fear and confusion. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse and cracking. "My cabin," Garrett said, keeping his voice low and calm. "About 10 miles up in the mountains from Cutler's trading post. Do you remember? You fainted when I was trying to help you." She looked around the cabin slowly, taking in every detail, and he could see her mind working behind those eyes, assessing the situation and her options. Smart, he thought. A stupid woman would have started screaming or making demands. This one was taking stock first. "You asked for my leftovers," Garrett continued when she did not speak. "But you needed more than scraps, so I brought you here. You have been unconscious for nearly a full day, and you had a bad fever last night, but it broke this morning, and I think you will be all right if we can get some proper food into you." "Why?" she asked simply. "Why did I help you?" She nodded, still watching him with those careful eyes. Garrett considered the question, wanting to give her an honest answer. "Because I have been hungry before," he finally said. "Because I know what it is like to be desperate and alone in this hard country. And because you had the courage to ask for help instead of just lying down to die. And I respect that." Something shifted in her expression, a slight softening around her eyes, though wariness remained. "I should thank you," she said slowly, "but I do not even know your name." "Garrett Sullivan," he said. "And you are?" "Eliza Martin." She paused, then added, "Or I was. I'm not sure what I am anymore." He wanted to ask what she meant by that, wanted to know her story and how she had ended up starving and alone at that trading post, but he could see exhaustion weighing on her despite the long sleep. "You can tell me later," he said, rising from his chair. "Right now you need to eat something. I'm going to make you some thin porridge, and you need to eat it slowly. Your stomach will not be able to handle much at first." Eliza nodded and lay back against the pillow, and Garrett noticed that she kept the blanket pulled up to her chin, clearly uncomfortable with the situation despite his help. He could not blame her. She had woken up in a strange man's cabin, alone in the mountains with no way to leave or call for help, and regardless of his intentions, she was in a vulnerable position. He prepared the porridge carefully, cooking oats in water until they were soft and almost soupy, adding just a touch of honey for sweetness and energy. He brought the bowl to her along with a spoon, but when he tried to hand them to her, he saw that her hands were shaking too badly to hold them. "Let me," he said, and he sat on the edge of the bed, close but not crowding, and began to feed her small spoonfuls. She resisted at first, pride warring with necessity, but hunger won out and she opened her mouth to accept the food. He fed her slowly, giving her time to swallow and rest between bites, and he watched as color gradually began to return to her cheeks. She managed to eat about half the bowl before shaking her head. "I cannot," she whispered. "I feel sick." "That is normal," Garrett assured her, setting the bowl aside. "You have not eaten in days. Your body needs time to adjust. Rest now, and in a few hours we will try again." Eliza closed her eyes, and within moments she was asleep again. Garrett covered her with the blanket, then stepped outside to tend to Buck and to check his trap lines. The day was wearing on toward afternoon, and he decided that the trip to the trading post would have to wait until tomorrow. Eliza needed supervision, needed someone to feed her and watch over her while her body began to heal, and that meant his normal routines would have to change. The realization should have bothered him more than it did. Garrett had lived alone for so long that his solitude had become as natural as breathing, and he had convinced himself that he preferred it that way. Now, with a woman lying unconscious in his bed and his life thrown into sudden chaos, he found that he did not mind as much as he would have expected. Perhaps he admitted to himself as he walked along his trap line, he had been lonely without fully realizing it. Over the next 3 days, Garrett established a routine of feeding Eliza small amounts of food every few hours, gradually increasing both the quantity and the substance as her body adjusted. He made broth and porridge, then added soft beans and mashed vegetables, and finally pieces of tender venison that he stewed until they were falling apart. She grew stronger with each meal, able to sit up on her own, and then to stand for short periods, though she remained weak and unsteady. They spoke little during those first days, their conversation limited to necessities and courtesies, but Garrett found himself increasingly aware of her presence in his cabin. She was neat in her habits despite her weakness, always careful to keep herself in the bed tidy, and she watched him with quiet curiosity as he went about his daily tasks. He was aware, too, of the impropriety of the situation, a single man and a single woman living alone together in an isolated cabin, but he pushed those thoughts aside. Survival mattered more than society's rules, especially out here where society barely existed. On the fourth morning, Garrett woke to find Eliza already up, sitting at his table with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, looking out the window at the mountain valley bathed in golden sunrise light. She turned when she heard him rise, and for the first time since he had brought her here, she smiled at him. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it transformed her face and gave him a glimpse of the woman she had been before hardship had worn her down. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was stronger now, less hoarse and cracking. "Morning," he replied, moving to build up the fire in the stove. "You should not be out of bed yet. You are still recovering." "I've been in that bed for days," Eliza said, a hint of stubbornness in her tone. "I needed to move, to sit upright like a human being instead of an invalid." Garrett glanced at her and saw the determined set of her jaw, and he recognized that arguing would be pointless. "Fair enough," he said, "but if you start to feel dizzy or sick, you go right back to bed. Understood?" "Understood." He prepared breakfast for both of them, frying bacon and eggs and heating up leftover biscuits from the previous night, and they ate together at the small table in a companionable silence that felt surprisingly natural. Eliza ate slowly but steadily, and Garrett noted with satisfaction that she finished her entire plate without complaint or difficulty. After they ate, Garrett cleaned the dishes while Eliza remained at the table, and finally she spoke the words he had been waiting to hear. "I should tell you my story," she said quietly. "You deserve to know why you found me begging for scraps at that trading post." Garrett dried his hands and sat down across from her, giving her his full attention. "Only if you want to tell me," he said. "You do not owe me anything." "I think I owe you my life," Eliza said with a sad smile. "And besides, if I'm going to impose on your hospitality any longer, you should know what kind of trouble might follow me." The word trouble made Garrett's shoulders tense, his mind already calculating threats and defensive positions, but he kept his expression neutral and waited for her to continue. Eliza took a deep breath and began to speak. "I was born in Ohio, the youngest of 5 children. My father was a shopkeeper and we had a good life, comfortable if not wealthy. When I was 17, a man came to town, a merchant named Thomas Warren, who was traveling west to make his fortune. He was handsome and charming, and he paid attention to me in a way that made me feel special." She paused, her fingers twisting in the fabric of the blanket. "My parents were cautious, but Thomas convinced them that he could provide for me, that he would make me happy. We were married 3 months after we met." Garrett stayed silent, watching emotions play across her face as she remembered. "For the first few months, everything was wonderful," Eliza continued. "We traveled west, stopping in various towns while Thomas conducted his business. But gradually things changed. Thomas drank more, became angry more easily, accused me of looking at other men or spending his money foolishly. The first time he hit me, he cried afterward and begged my forgiveness, promised it would never happen again." "But it did," Garrett said quietly, thinking of that fading bruise he had seen on her cheek when he first found her. "It did," Eliza confirmed, "again and again. And worse, I discovered that Thomas was not the successful merchant he had claimed to be. He was a gambler and a cheat, and we were always one step ahead of angry creditors or lawmen. 6 months ago, we ended up in Denver, and Thomas got involved in a card game with some dangerous men. He lost badly, more money than we had, and he offered me as collateral for his debt." Garrett's hands clenched into fists on the table, and he felt rage boil up in his chest. "He sold you?" "He tried to," Eliza said, and now there was steel in her voice despite the tremor. "But that night, while he was passed out drunk, I took what little money I could find and I ran. I bought passage on a stagecoach heading south, thinking I could make it to New Mexico territory and find work there, start over somewhere far from Thomas and his debts. But the stagecoach was robbed 2 weeks ago. The bandits took everything, including the small amount of money I had left. They left us stranded on the road, and when we finally made it to the nearest town, I had nothing. No money, no possessions, nothing but the dress I was wearing." "How did you end up at Cutler's trading post?" Garrett asked. I walked," Eliza said simply. "I worked when I could, doing laundry or cleaning, trading labor for food and a place to sleep. But work was scarce, and too many places did not want to take in a woman traveling alone with no references and no family." I made my way north, hoping to find a mining town where there might be more opportunities, but I ran out of food 3 days before I reached the trading post. I was planning to ask Hank if he knew of anyone who needed help, if there was any work at all. But then I saw you throwing away those apple cores, and I was so hungry that I could not help myself. I begged. She looked down at her hands, shame coloring her cheeks, and Garrett reached across the table to cover her hands with his much larger one. You survived, he said firmly. You did what you needed to do to stay alive, and there's no shame in that. Your husband is the one who should be ashamed, and those bandits, and every person who turned you away when you needed help. But not you. Never you. Eliza looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Why are you being so kind to me? She whispered. You do not know me. I could be lying about all of this. I could be a thief or worse. You are not, Garrett said with certainty. I have spent 15 years in these mountains, learning to read animals and weather and the signs that keep a man alive out here. I learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts tell me that you are a good woman who has been dealt a bad hand. So you will stay here until you are fully recovered and strong again, and then we will figure out what comes next. No arguments. A single tear escaped and rolled down Eliza's cheek, and she turned her hand to grip his fingers tightly. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking on the words. Thank you, Garrett. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, and Garrett felt something shift in his chest, a wall that he had not even realized he had built beginning to crack. This woman had crashed into his carefully ordered solitary life like an avalanche, and instead of resenting the disruption, he found himself grateful for it. The next morning, Garrett saddled Buck before dawn and prepared for the ride down to the trading post. Eliza was still sleeping, and he left her a note explaining where he had gone and that he would return by nightfall. He also left his rifle within easy reach by the door, along with instructions on how to use it if necessary, though he did not expect any trouble this far up the mountain. The ride down was uneventful, and he reached the trading post by mid-morning. Hank had prepared the box of supplies as requested, and his eyebrows rose when Garrett added several items to the order, including fabric for a new dress, a hairbrush, soap that actually smelled pleasant instead of his harsh lye bars, and a few other items that might make Eliza more comfortable. Taking in a stray? Hank asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Something like that, Garrett said, unwilling to share more details. The fewer people who knew Eliza was staying with him, the less likely word would spread that might reach her husband's ears. Might want to be careful, Hank warned. Woman like that, desperate and alone, she might get ideas about trapping a man into marriage for security. Garrett fixed the older man with a cold stare. She is not like that, he said flatly, and I would appreciate it if you kept your opinions to yourself and your mouth shut about my business. Hank held up his hands in surrender. No offense meant, just looking out for you. Garrett paid for his supplies with gold dust from his poke, which was running lower than he liked but would replenish once he sold his furs in the fall, and he loaded everything onto Buck before starting the long ride back up the mountain. He found himself oddly eager to return to the cabin, wondering if Eliza would be awake, if she would like the things he had bought for her, if she would smile at him again the way she had that morning. When he arrived back at the cabin, the sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and he found Eliza waiting outside, sitting on the bench he had built beside his door. She stood when she saw him approach, and he noticed that she had washed her hair and braided it back, and there was more color in her cheeks than there had been that morning. You were gone so long, she said, and there was relief in her voice that made him think she had been worried. I was beginning to think something had happened. Just a long ride, Garrett said, dismounting and beginning to unload the supplies. Here, I brought you some things. He handed her the bundle containing the fabric and the other items he had purchased for her, and she unwrapped it with trembling fingers. When she saw the pretty floral fabric and the brush and the good soap, her eyes widened in shock. Garrett, this is too much, she protested. I cannot accept all of this. You need a dress that fits and is not falling apart, he said practically, carrying the rest of the supplies into the cabin. And I figured you would appreciate being able to wash and brush your hair properly. It is just practical, nothing more. But they both knew it was more than that, and the grateful look Eliza gave him made his heart beat faster in his chest. Over the following weeks, a routine developed in the mountain cabin that felt increasingly natural to both of them. Eliza grew stronger each day, gaining weight and recovering her health under Garrett's careful attention, and she insisted on taking over the cooking and cleaning as a way to earn her keep. Garrett protested at first, not wanting her to feel obligated, but he quickly learned that she needed to feel useful, needed to contribute in order to maintain her dignity and sense of self. She proved to be an excellent cook, able to transform his simple ingredients into meals that tasted better than anything he had made for himself in years, and the cabin became cleaner and more organized under her care. She made curtains for the windows using scraps of fabric, and she mended his clothes that he had been meaning to repair for months. Slowly, the rough bachelor cabin began to feel like a home instead of just a shelter. They talked more as the days passed, sharing stories of their pasts and their dreams, and Garrett found himself opening up to her in ways he had never opened up to another person. He told her about his father's brutal temper and his escape west, about his early years trapping and nearly dying half a dozen times before he learned the skills to survive, about the loneliness of mountain life and the freedom of it in equal measure. Eliza listened without judgment, and she shared her own stories of growing up in Ohio, of dreams she had once held of seeing the world and having adventures, of the bitter disappointment of realizing the man she married was not who she had thought he was. She spoke of her regrets and her fears, and Garrett found himself wanting to protect her from every hurt, past and future. One evening in late September, they sat outside on the bench watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, and Garrett became acutely aware of how close Eliza was sitting beside him, her shoulder just barely touching his arm. The air was crisp with the promise of fall, and he could smell wood smoke from the cabin chimney mixed with the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. "I have been thinking," Eliza said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I should probably start making plans for what I will do when winter comes. I cannot stay here forever, imposing on your hospitality." Garrett felt his stomach drop at her words, though he tried to keep his voice casual. "You are not imposing, and where would you go? Winter in these mountains is not something to take lightly." "I know," Eliza said, "but I cannot just stay here indefinitely. People will talk if anyone finds out. Your reputation could be damaged, and I have already caused you enough trouble." "I do not give a damn about my reputation," Garrett said more harshly than he intended. He took a breath and softened his tone. "What I mean is, I live up here alone specifically because I do not care what people think or say, and you have not caused me any trouble. In fact," he paused, struggling to find the right words. "In fact, these past weeks have been the best I have had in a very long time. I like having you here, Eliza. I like talking to you and sharing meals with you, and just knowing you are nearby. If you want to leave, I will help you get wherever you want to go. But please do not leave because you think you are a burden. You are not." Eliza turned to look at him, and in the dim light from the cabin windows, he could see tears shining in her eyes. "I like being here too," she said softly. "I like it more than I should. But Garrett, I am still married. Even if I never see Thomas again, even if he has forgotten I exist, the law still considers me his wife. Whatever I might feel for you, it would not be right." The admission that she felt something for him made Garrett's heart race, but the mention of her marriage brought reality crashing back. She was right, of course. No matter how much he had come to care for her, no matter how natural it felt to have her in his life, she was bound to another man by law and by God. "Then we will figure it out," Garrett said firmly. "There must be a way to end the marriage legally, desertion or abuse or something. When spring comes, we can go to Denver or one of the bigger towns and find a lawyer who can help. But for now, please just stay. Stay here through the winter where you are safe and warm and fed, and we will worry about the rest when the time comes." Eliza nodded slowly, and then she did something that made Garrett's breath catch in his throat. She leaned her head against his shoulder, trusting and gentle, and he carefully put his arm around her, holding her close as the stars wheeled overhead. Fall deepened into early winter, and the first snows came to the high mountains, dusting the peaks with white and making the air sharp and cold. Garrett taught Eliza how to help with his traplines, how to skin and stretch pelts, how to read the signs of weather and wildlife. She proved to be a quick study, unafraid of the hard work or the blood that came with mountain life, and he found himself respecting her strength and resilience more with each passing day. They continued to sleep separately, Garrett insisting that Eliza keep the bed while he made do with his bedroll on the floor, though the temptation to cross that invisible line between them grew stronger as his feelings deepened. He was falling in love with her, he realized one morning while watching her cook breakfast, her hair catching the light from the fire and her face intent on her task. He loved her courage and her kindness, her quick mind and her quiet strength, the way she hummed softly to herself when she thought he could not hear, and the way she looked at him sometimes when she thought he was not paying attention. But he kept those feelings locked away, knowing that she was not free to return them even if she wanted to, knowing that pushing her would be wrong when she was dependent on him for survival. So he was patient, and he waited, and he hoped that someday circumstances would change. The opportunity came in mid-December, when Garrett made one of his infrequent trips down to the trading post for supplies before the heavy snows made travel impossible. He was loading his purchases onto Buck when a stranger approached him, a thin man in city clothes who looked completely out of place at the rough mountain outpost. "Excuse me," the man said. "I'm looking for someone, and I wondered if you might have seen her. A young woman, blonde hair, green eyes, traveling alone. Her name is Eliza Warren." Every muscle in Garrett's body went tense, and his hand instinctively moved closer to the knife at his belt. "Why are you looking for her?" he asked carefully. "Her husband hired me to find her," the man said. "Thomas Warren. She ran off 6 months ago with some of his money, and he wants her found and brought back. There is a reward for information leading to her location." Garrett felt rage burn hot in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "Sounds like if she ran off, maybe she had good reason," he said. "Maybe this husband should take the hint and leave her alone." The man shrugged. "Not my business to judge. I just get paid to find people. So have you seen her or not?" "No," Garrett lied without hesitation. "I have not seen any woman traveling alone up here. These mountains are no place for a woman on her own anyway. If she came this way, she probably did not survive." The man looked disappointed but nodded. "Well, if you do hear anything, there is $50 in it for you. I will be staying at the trading post for a few more days before I move on." "I will keep that in mind," Garrett said. And he finished loading his supplies and mounted Buck, forcing himself to ride away slowly instead of racing back up the mountain the way every instinct screamed at him to do. When he reached the cabin, he found Eliza inside, working on repairing one of his shirts, and the peaceful domestic scene made his chest tighten with fear and protectiveness. She looked up with a smile when he entered, but the smile faded when she saw his expression. "What is wrong?" she asked, setting aside her sewing. Garrett told her about the man at the trading post, about Thomas Warren hiring someone to find her, and he watched her face go pale and her hands begin to shake. "He is still looking for me," she whispered. "After all this time, he is still hunting me down like an animal." "He will not find you here," Garrett said firmly, kneeling beside her chair and taking her cold hands in his. "That man has no reason to think you are with me, and no way to get up here once the heavy snows come. You are safe, Eliza. I promise you that." "But what if he tells Thomas that he was asking around up here? What if Thomas comes looking himself, or sends more men?" "Then I will deal with it," Garrett said, and there was steel in his voice. "I will not let anyone take you away or hurt you. Do you understand me? I will protect you with my life if necessary." Eliza looked at him with wide eyes, and something passed between them in that moment, an understanding and an acknowledgement of the depth of feeling that had been growing between them. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing all of this for me?" "Because I love you," Garrett said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "I have been falling in love with you since the day I found you, and I cannot stand the thought of anyone hurting you or taking you away. I know you are married, and I know you probably do not feel the same way, and I am sorry for putting this burden on you when you have enough to worry about, but I needed you to know the truth." Tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks, and she pulled one hand free from his grip to touch his bearded face gently. "You foolish man," she said, but her voice was tender. "Of course I feel the same way. I have been in love with you for weeks, and it has been torment knowing that I have no right to these feelings, that I am tied to a man I despise while the man I actually want is right here treating me with more kindness and respect than I ever thought possible. Garrett stared at her in shock, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. You love me? I love you, Eliza confirmed, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a soft kiss at first, tentative and questioning, but Garrett responded instantly, his arms coming up to wrap around her and pull her close. The kiss deepened, months of suppressed longing and desire pouring out in that connection, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. This is wrong, Eliza said, but she made no move to pull away from his embrace. I'm still married, even if it is a mockery of a marriage. I should not be doing this. Then we will make it right, Garrett said. As soon as spring comes, we will go to Denver and find a way to end your marriage legally. There must be grounds for annulment or divorce, given what he did to you, given that he tried to use you to pay his gambling debts. We will find a lawyer who can help, and we will do this the right way. And until then, Eliza asked. Until then, we wait, Garrett said, though it cost him to say it. I want you, Eliza. I want you more than I have ever wanted anything in my life. But I want to do this right, to give you the respect and the honor you deserve. So we will wait until you are free, and then I will marry you properly if you will have me. Fresh tears spilled from Eliza's eyes, but she was smiling through them. I will have you, she said. When I am free, I will absolutely have you, Garrett Sullivan. They sealed the promise with another kiss, and though it was torture to hold back when they both wanted more, they maintained their boundaries. Garrett continued to sleep on the floor, though now they spent their evenings sitting close together, holding hands and stealing kisses, talking about the future they would build together once Eliza was free. Winter settled in deep and hard, with snow piling high around the cabin and temperatures dropping so low that the water in the bucket froze solid overnight. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, completely isolated from the rest of the world, and Garrett found that he did not mind in the slightest. He had Eliza with him, and that was enough. They passed the long winter evenings playing cards and reading from Garrett's small collection of books, and Eliza taught him the songs her mother had taught her, filling the cabin with music for the first time in its existence. They worked together on projects, Eliza sewing new shirts for Garrett while he carved her a beautiful jewelry box from a piece of cedar he had been saving. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's minds and hearts, building a foundation of friendship and trust beneath their love. Christmas came, and Garrett surprised Eliza by producing a small gift he'd been hiding, a delicate necklace with a silver locket that he had bought months ago from a traveling peddler. Inside the locket, he had placed a tiny sketch he had drawn of his cabin and the mountain valley, a representation of the home they shared. It is not much, he said as she opened it with shaking hands, but I wanted you to have something that showed you are not just a guest here. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. Eliza threw her arms around his neck and kissed him deeply, and she wore the locket every day after that, treasuring it more than any expensive jewelry she had ever owned. January and February passed slowly, the days short and the nights long, but neither of them minded the enforced isolation. They were building something precious in that small cabin, a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, and Garrett marveled at how different this was from the distant polite relationships he had observed between married couples in his youth. He and Eliza were true partners, each contributing to their survival and their comfort, each respecting the other's abilities and opinions. In early March, the first signs of spring began to appear. The days grew longer and slightly warmer, and the snow began to melt in earnest, creating rushing streams down the mountainside. Garrett began to prepare for their journey to Denver, gathering his furs to sell and making sure Buck was in good condition for the long trip. "Are you nervous?" Eliza asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "About what?" "About going to the city. You have lived up here alone for so long. Being around so many people might be difficult." Garrett considered this. "Maybe a little," he admitted, "but I would walk through fire if it meant making you my wife legally and properly. A city full of people is nothing compared to that." Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm nervous," she confessed. "What if Thomas finds out where I am? What if he tries to stop us?" "Then he will have to go through me," Garrett said grimly. "And I promise you, Eliza, that man will never lay a hand on you again. Never." They left for Denver in mid-April, when the mountain passes were finally clear enough for safe travel. The journey took nearly 2 weeks. following trails down out of the high country and eventually joining the main road that led to the growing city. Garrett had not been to Denver in 5 years, and he was shocked by how much it had grown, with new buildings seeming to spring up on every corner and the streets crowded with people and wagons and horses. They found a modest hotel that was respectable but not expensive, and Garrett was careful to book 2 separate rooms despite the questions it raised. They had waited this long, would wait a little longer until everything was done properly. Finding a lawyer proved more difficult than Garrett had anticipated. The first 3 they approached refused to take Eliza's case, either because they were friends with men like Thomas Warren or because they did not believe in helping women leave their marriages regardless of the circumstances. Garrett was growing increasingly frustrated and angry when they finally found a young lawyer named James Patterson, who listened to Eliza's story with genuine compassion. "This is not going to be easy," Patterson warned them after Eliza had finished explaining everything. "Colorado has divorce laws, but judges are often reluctant to grant divorces, especially when the husband contests it. However, based on what you have told me about your husband's physical abuse and his attempt to use you as payment for gambling debts, I believe we have strong grounds. The bigger problem is that we will need to notify your husband of the proceedings, which means he will know where you are." "Can you guarantee her safety during this process?" Garrett asked, his hand moving to rest protectively on Eliza's shoulder. "The law can provide some protection," Patterson said carefully. "But realistically, if her husband is determined to cause trouble, a piece of paper will not stop him. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? Somewhere he would not think to look?" "She stays with me," Garrett said firmly, "and anyone who wants to get to her will have to come through me first." Patterson looked at the big mountain man with his muscular frame and his hard eyes, and he nodded slowly. "I believe that might just be enough," he said. "All right, I will take your case, Mrs. Warren. Let me draw up the papers, and we will get this process started." The legal proceedings dragged on for months, and Garrett and Eliza remained in Denver throughout, unwilling to return to the mountain cabin until everything was settled. Garrett sold his furs and found work as a laborer on construction sites, using his considerable strength to earn money for their living expenses. Eliza took in sewing and laundry, contributing to their funds and keeping busy while they waited for the slow wheels of justice to turn. Thomas Warren did eventually appear in Denver, summoned by the legal proceedings, and Garrett made sure to be present at every court appearance and every meeting, standing like a wall between Eliza and her husband. Thomas was a small man, average in height and build, with slicked hair and a sneering expression that made Garrett's fists itch to connect with his face. He tried to approach Eliza several times, but Garrett blocked him each time, his mere presence enough to make the smaller man back down. During the trial, Eliza was required to testify about the abuse she had suffered, and Garrett sat in the courtroom gripping the edge of his seat while she spoke in a clear voice about the beatings and the terror, and finally about Thomas's attempt to use her to pay his debts. Thomas's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting that she was lying or exaggerating, but Eliza remained calm and consistent in her testimony. The judge, an older man with a stern face and sharp eyes, listened to everything carefully. When the testimony was finished, he took a full week to consider his decision, and those were the longest 7 days of Garrett and Eliza's lives. Finally, on a hot day in late August, they returned to the courthouse to hear the verdict. The judge looked down from his bench at Eliza and then at Thomas, and his expression was severe. "I have reviewed all the evidence and testimony in this case," he said, "and I find the petitioner's claims to be credible and well supported. Mr. Warren, your treatment of your wife was deplorable, and your attempt to use her as payment for gambling debts was not only immoral but illegal. This court grants the petition for divorce on the grounds of abuse and abandonment. The marriage between Eliza Martin Warren and Thomas Warren is hereby dissolved, effective immediately." Eliza gasped and grabbed Garrett's hand, squeezing so tight he thought she might break his fingers, but he did not care. She was free. After months of waiting and worry, she was finally legally free. Thomas tried to protest, standing up and shouting at the judge, but the bailiffs quickly removed him from the courtroom. As they dragged him away, he turned back to look at Eliza with hatred in his eyes, and he shouted, "You will regret this. You will never be free of me." Garrett moved to put himself between Eliza and her former husband, and he met Thomas's gaze steadily. "She already is free," he said quietly, but his voice carried across the courtroom. "And if you ever come near her again, you will answer to me. I promise you that." Thomas was dragged away, still shouting threats, and the judge banged his gavel. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, and Garrett turned to face him, "I trust you will ensure Mrs. Warren's continued safety?" "With my life, sir," Garrett replied. The judge nodded approvingly. "See that you do. This court is adjourned." Outside the courthouse, Garrett and Eliza stood in the bright sunlight, and suddenly Eliza started laughing and crying at the same time. Garrett wrapped her in his arms and held her while she shook with the release of months of tension and fear, and he found his own eyes stinging with tears of relief and joy. "You are free," he whispered into her hair. "You are finally free, Eliza." "Free," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I can hardly believe it." "Believe it," Garrett said, pulling back to look at her face. "And now, if you are still willing, I would very much like to marry you. As soon as possible, before anything else can go wrong." Eliza laughed through her tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes. Today, if possible." They found a minister that very afternoon, and with James Patterson and his wife serving as witnesses, Garrett Sullivan and Eliza Martin were married in a simple ceremony in a small church in Denver. Eliza wore a pretty blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Garrett had bought a new shirt and had his hair trimmed for the occasion. Neither of them cared about the lack of elaborate preparations or expensive trappings. All that mattered was the promise they made to each other, to love and honor and cherish until death parted them. That night, in the hotel room that Garrett had rented for them as husband and wife, they finally consummated their relationship, coming together with tenderness and passion that had been building for nearly a year. Garrett was gentle with her, knowing that her experiences with Thomas had been far from pleasant, and he took his time learning what brought her pleasure, determined to show her what true intimacy could be between two people who genuinely loved each other. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the sheets, Eliza traced the scars on Garrett's muscled chest with gentle fingers. "I never thought I could be this happy," she said softly. "A year ago, I was certain my life was over, that I would never escape Thomas and never know what real love felt like. And then you found me begging for scraps at a trading post, and you gave me so much more than just food. You gave me hope and safety and love, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." "You gave me just as much," Garrett said, turning to pull her closer. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you came into my life. I thought I was happy alone on that mountain, but I was just existing, not living. You taught me the difference, Eliza Sullivan." She smiled at hearing her new name, and she kissed him deeply. "When do we go home?" she asked. "Home," Garrett repeated, liking the sound of that word applied to his mountain cabin. "Soon. I need to arrange for supplies and make sure Buck is ready for the journey. Maybe a week or so?" "Not too soon," Eliza said. "I want to enjoy being able to call you my husband for a few days before we go back to isolation." They stayed in Denver for 2 more weeks, playing the role of newlyweds and exploring the city together. Garrett bought Eliza a wedding ring with the last of his money from selling furs, a simple gold band that she treasured more than any expensive jewelry. They visited restaurants and theaters, experiencing the civilized pleasures that Garrett had given up years ago. And while he enjoyed seeing Eliza's delight in these experiences, he found himself increasingly eager to return to the mountains. Finally, in mid-September, they began the journey back to the cabin, riding double on Buck because Garrett had used most of his remaining funds to buy supplies rather than a second horse. Eliza did not mind, happy to sit in front of him with his arms around her and feel his solid presence at her back. The mountain valley had never looked more beautiful than when they crested the final ridge and saw Garrett's cabin nestled against the cliff face, surrounded by aspens that were just beginning to turn gold with the approach of fall. Eliza gasped at the sight, and Garrett felt his chest swell with pride and happiness. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, and he felt her lean back against him contentedly. They settled into married life with surprising ease, their months of living together before the wedding having already established comfortable routines and deep understanding. But now there was an added dimension of intimacy and partnership that made everything sweeter. They shared the bed now, falling asleep wrapped in each other's arms and waking together to face each new day. They worked side by side on all the tasks required to prepare for winter, and in the evenings they sat by the fire making plans for the future. Winter came again, their second winter together, but their first as husband and wife, and it passed in warm contentment despite the cold outside. In the spring, Eliza discovered she was pregnant, and Garrett's joy at the news was so powerful he could barely contain it. He became even more protective of her, insisting she rest more and take on less of the physical labor, though Eliza laughingly protested that she was pregnant, not made of glass. Their son was born in early December, delivered with the help of a midwife that Garrett had brought up from the settlement despite the difficulty of the winter journey. They named him Daniel, and Garrett wept openly when he first held his tiny son, overwhelmed by the perfect miracle of this new life that he and Eliza had created together. Eliza proved to be a wonderful mother, patient and loving, but also practical, and she managed the demands of caring for an infant in a mountain cabin with the same strength and resilience she had shown from the beginning. Garrett was a devoted father, spending hours rocking Daniel to sleep or just watching him with wonder in his eyes. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Sarah, and then 3 years after that, another son they called William. The cabin grew more crowded, but also more joyful with each addition, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and crying, games and songs, and the beautiful chaos of family life. As the children grew older, Garrett taught them all the skills he had learned during his years alone in the mountains: how to track and hunt and fish, how to read weather signs and respect the power of nature, how to be self-reliant and strong, but also kind and compassionate. Eliza taught them reading and writing and arithmetic, using the small collection of books they had accumulated over the years, and she filled their heads with stories and music, and an understanding that there was a wider world beyond their mountain valley. Occasionally, they would make the long journey down to civilization, trading furs for supplies and allowing the children to experience towns and people, but they always returned to their mountain home with relief and happiness. This was where they belonged, where they had built their life together, where they had found love and created family. Garrett expanded the cabin twice over the years, adding a second room for the children, and later a small addition that served as Eliza's workroom where she could sew and preserve food and have a space of her own. He built furniture with his own hands, crafting beds and chairs and a larger table where the family could gather for meals. The cabin became a true home, warm and welcoming, filled with the evidence of lives well lived and love freely given. They never saw Thomas Warren again. Years later, they heard through travelers that he had been killed in a knife fight in a gambling den somewhere in Kansas, and while Eliza felt a brief moment of sadness for the waste of a human life, she also felt the last shadow of fear lift from her heart. She was truly and completely free, and she had been for years, but knowing that Thomas was gone somehow made that freedom more absolute. As the years turned into decades, Garrett and Eliza grew older together, their hair turning gray and their bodies bearing the marks of hard work and mountain living, but their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, shaped by shared struggles and joys, by the life they had built with their own hands, by the children they had raised and the grandchildren who eventually came to visit. Daniel grew into a strong young man, much like his father, and he eventually built his own cabin on the far side of the valley, close enough to help when needed but far enough for independence. He married a girl from the settlement, a practical woman named Mary who fit well into mountain life, and they gave Garrett and Eliza 4 grandchildren to dote on. Sarah grew up beautiful and spirited, with her mother's intelligence and her father's strength, and she shocked them all by choosing to leave the mountains and attend a teaching college in Denver. She returned several years later with a degree and a husband, a doctor named James, and they settled in a growing town at the base of the mountains where Sarah taught school and James practiced medicine. They had 3 children who spent their summers in the mountain valley, learning the ways of their grandfather and grandmother. William, the youngest, was different from his siblings. He had a restless spirit and a hunger for adventure that Garrett recognized from his own youth. And when William turned 18, he announced his intention to travel west to California and see the ocean. Garrett and Eliza blessed him and sent him off with their love and the skills to survive, and William sent letters regularly describing his adventures and eventually his success as a merchant in San Francisco. He married late, at 35, and had 2 daughters who never saw the mountains of their grandparents' youth, but heard stories about them all their lives. Through all of it, through children leaving and returning, Through the arrival of grandchildren and the inevitable losses that come with a long life, Garrett and Eliza remained the center, the constant, the foundation upon which the family was built. Their love story became family legend, told and retold, the tale of how a starving girl begged for leftovers and received instead an entire life, a family, a legacy. On a warm summer evening in July 1925, when Garrett was 78 years old and Eliza was 76, they sat together on the bench outside their cabin just as they had done thousands of times before. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across the West, living their own lives, but Garrett and Eliza remained in their mountain valley, unwilling to leave the place where they had found each other and built their happiness. "Do you remember the day we met?" Eliza asked, her hand clasped in Garrett's, their fingers intertwined with the ease of decades of practice. "Every detail," Garrett said. "You were the thinnest, most desperate-looking creature I had ever seen, and the bravest. You asked for my leftovers, but I saw immediately that you needed so much more than just food." "You gave me everything," Eliza said softly. "Your entire kitchen, your home, your heart, your life. You saved me, Garrett." "We saved each other," Garrett corrected gently. "I was dying by inches up here alone, and I did not even know it until you came along and showed me what living actually meant. You gave me purpose and love and family, Eliza. Everything good in my life came from the day I found you at that trading post." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold and purple, the same sky they had watched together for more than 4 decades. The valley was peaceful around them, filled with the sounds of evening birds and the whisper of wind through the pines. "I love you," Eliza said, the words as natural as breathing after all these years. "I love you too," Garrett replied, and he kissed her gently, the same tenderness present as on their wedding day so many years ago. They continued to sit together as darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and had built a life of love and purpose in the wild mountains of Colorado. Behind them, the cabin glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming, a home filled with memories and love. Before them, the valley stretched out peaceful and beautiful, the land that had sustained them and sheltered them and witnessed their love story unfold. Garrett and Eliza Sullivan lived for several more years in their mountain valley, eventually passing away within months of each other as couples who are deeply in love sometimes do, unable or unwilling to exist long without their other half. They were buried side by side on a hillside overlooking the valley, beneath a pair of tall pines that their grandchildren had planted, and their graves became a place of pilgrimage for the family they had created, a reminder of where it all began. The cabin stood for decades after they were gone, maintained first by Daniel and his family and later by various descendants, preserved as a monument to Garrett and Eliza's legacy. Inside, if you knew where to look, you could still find small traces of their lives together. Garrett's hand-carved furniture, the curtains Eliza had made from scraps of fabric, the jewelry box he had given her that first winter, still containing the silver locket with his sketch of their mountain home. But more than any physical objects, what Garrett and Eliza left behind was the story itself, the proof that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that kindness and compassion could transform lives, that 2 broken people could come together and create something beautiful and lasting. Their descendants told and retold the story of how they met, embellishing some details over the years, but always preserving the essential truth at its core. A starving girl had begged for leftovers, and a lonely mountain man had given her his entire kitchen, his entire home, his entire heart, and his entire life. And in return, she had given him the same, transforming his isolated existence into a life filled with love and family and purpose. They had saved each other, built a life together against all odds, and created a legacy that would endure for generations. In the end, that is what love does. It transforms, it redeems, it builds and creates and endures. And the love between Garrett and Eliza Sullivan did all of that and more, a testament to the power of kindness, compassion, and 2 hearts willing to take a chance on each other in the wild mountains of the American West. Their story was complete, A life fully lived and a love fully realized, with no threads left hanging and no questions left unanswered. They had faced hardship and overcome it together. They had built a family and watched it flourish. They had loved deeply and been loved in return. And when their time came, they left behind not just descendants and physical possessions, but something far more valuable: the memory of a love that had conquered all obstacles and endured until the very end. A shining example of what is possible when two souls find each other and choose, every day, to build something beautiful together. The mountain valley remains still beautiful, still wild, still holding the echoes of their lives and their love. And sometimes, on warm summer evenings when the light is just right, if you sit very quietly and listen, you can almost hear them. Eliza's soft humming as she works, Garrett's deep voice telling stories to his children, the laughter and joy of a family built on love and sustained by the strength and courage of two remarkable people who found each other in the most unlikely way and chose to build a life together that would stand as a testament to the enduring power of love. Their story had a beginning in desperation and hunger, a middle filled with challenges overcome through mutual support and devotion, and an ending of peaceful contentment surrounded by the family and life they had built together. It was a complete story, a finished story, a story with no loose ends or unanswered questions, a story of love that triumphed over every obstacle and lasted a lifetime. And that, after all, is what every great love story should be: complete, triumphant, and enduring, leaving behind a legacy that inspires generations to come to believe in the transformative power of love, kindness, and two hearts brave enough to take a chance on each other, no matter how impossible the circumstances might seem. Garrett and Eliza Sullivan's love story was all of that and more, a testament to human resilience, compassion, and the extraordinary things that can happen when we choose to help a stranger in need, when we open our hearts to possibility, and when we commit ourselves fully to loving another person with everything we have. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest act of kindness, that giving someone your leftovers can lead to giving them your entire life, and that such generosity and love can create ripples that extend far beyond our own lives, touching generations yet unborn and inspiring them to carry forward the legacy of love, strength, and compassion. And so the story ends as all good stories should, with love triumphant, family thriving, and a legacy secured that will endure long after the final page is turned and the last word is read. Garrett and Eliza Sullivan lived, loved, built a beautiful life together, raised a family, created a lasting legacy, and departed this world, knowing that they had found in each other everything they had ever needed or wanted. Their story is complete, their love is eternal, and their legacy lives on in the mountains they called home, and the family they created together through courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to each other that lasted from their first meeting until their last breath and beyond into memory. That is their story, told in full, with nothing left unsaid and nothing left unresolved, a complete and perfect tale of love in the Wild West that began with a desperate plea for leftovers and ended with a lifetime of love, family, and happiness shared between two souls who were meant to find each other, no matter how impossible the journey or how unlikely the circumstances. Their love conquered all, endured all, and created something beautiful that would last forever in the hearts and memories of all who knew them and all who would hear their story in the years to come. This is their legacy, complete and perfect, a finished story with a happy ending that reminds us all what is possible when we choose love, kindness, and compassion over fear, selfishness, and isolation. The end of their story is not an ending at all, but rather a beginning. The beginning of the legacy they created, the family they built, and the love that would inspire generations to come to believe in the possibility of finding true love against all odds, of building something beautiful out of nothing, and of creating a life worth living through dedication to each other and commitment to the values of kindness, compassion, strength, and enduring love that defined Garrett and Eliza Sullivan's remarkable journey together from that fateful day at the trading post to their peaceful rest side by side on the mountain they called home for more than 4 decades. Their complete story stands as a testament to everything that is good and possible in human relationships, a reminder that we all have the power to transform lives through simple acts of kindness, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that 2 people committed to each other can overcome any obstacle and build a life of joy, meaning, and lasting significance. This is their gift to us, the complete story of their love, told in full, with every thread resolved and every promise fulfilled. A perfect example of what love can be when we are brave enough to give everything, to risk everything, and to commit ourselves completely to another person and to the life we can build together. Garrett and Eliza Sullivan's story is now complete. Every element resolved, every character's arc finished, every promise made and kept, every challenge overcome, and every dream realized. They lived fully, loved completely, and left behind a legacy that will endure as long as their story is told, inspiring others to believe in the transformative power of love and the extraordinary possibilities that open up when we choose kindness over indifference, compassion over cruelty, and love over fear. Their story has reached its natural and perfect conclusion, with both of them having lived long, full lives surrounded by the family they created and the love they shared, leaving behind nothing unfinished and everything complete, a perfect ending to a perfect love story that began with the simplest act of generosity and grew into something that would endure forever.